I bolted upright in my bunk as the alarm tore through the barracks. The sound cut straight through whatever dream I'd been having, leaving my ears ringing in the sudden chaos of 30 soldiers scrambling in the dark. My watch read 3:17 a.m., the green digits glowing against the pitch-black interior of our quarters. This had never happened before. Not once in the 2 years I'd been stationed at this godforsaken outpost in the middle of Greenland's frozen wasteland. We ran drills, sure, but always during daylight hours when the cold wouldn't kill you in minutes. Base-wide alarms in the dead of night just didn't happen here. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom speakers mounted near the ceiling, cutting through the noise of men fumbling for their gear. All personnel, full winter gear, outside in 5 minutes. This is not a drill. The tone in his voice made my stomach clench. Mitchell wasn't the type to panic, but something in those clipped words carried an edge I'd never heard before. Around me, soldiers were pulling on thermal layers and heavy jackets with the kind of rushed movements that meant everyone else had picked up on it too. I yanked my gear from the locker beside my bunk, my fingers working automatically through the familiar routine of layering up for Arctic conditions. Thermal underwear first, then the thick wool socks, followed by the insulated pants and heavy winter jacket. The whole process usually took 10 minutes when done properly, but we were all cutting corners knowing that whatever had triggered this alarm couldn't wait for perfect preparation. The temperature outside hovered at -40 degrees. I checked the weather report before turning in, same as every night. At those temperatures, exposed skin would freeze in minutes, and even with full gear, prolonged exposure could be deadly. The fact that Mitchell was ordering us out there in the middle of the night meant something was seriously wrong. I joined the stream of soldiers filing through the barracks door, their heavy boots crunching on the metal grating. The cold hit me like a physical blow, even through all the layers I'd just pulled on. My breath formed thick white clouds that hung in the still air before disappearing into the darkness. Looking around at the faces lit up by the exterior lights of the compound, I could see the same confusion and tension reflected in everyone's expressions. These weren't fresh recruits who might panic at an unexpected drill. Most of us had been stationed here for at least a year, and we all knew this wasn't normal protocol. Daniel Ramsey stood about 10 feet to my left, and even in the dim lighting I could see his hands shaking as he worked to zip his jacket properly. The kid was always high-strung, but tonight he looked genuinely spooked. His breath came in short, rapid puffs, and he kept glancing around like he expected something to jump out at him from the shadows between buildings. Kyle Jensen was whispering urgent questions to the soldier next to him, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of boots on frozen ground and the general murmur of confused voices. Whatever he was asking, the other guy was just shaking his head in response. Nobody had answers. Captain Mitchell stood waiting in the center of the courtyard, a solid figure in his regulation winter gear. His posture was rigid, more formal than usual, and there was something in his stance that made him seem even more imposing than normal. The man commanded respect on any ordinary day, but tonight there was an intensity coming from him that I'd never witnessed before. "Formation now," he barked, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard in the thin, cold air. We moved into our standard assembly positions automatically, muscle memory taking over where confusion might have slowed us down. 37 soldiers arranged in neat rows, all of us standing at attention even though none of us had any idea what we were doing out here. The cold was already working its way through my boots, and I could feel the skin on my cheeks beginning to tighten as moisture froze. I'd served under Captain Mitchell for the entire 2 years of my posting here. In that time, I'd seen him handle equipment failures, medical emergencies, supply shortages, and communication blackouts with the same steady, professional demeanor. He was the kind of officer who never lost his cool, never raised his voice unless the situation absolutely demanded it, and never called unnecessary formations that put his men at risk. This was different. The way he held himself, the sharp precision of his movements, even the set of his jaw under the regulation cold weather gear. Everything about his bearing suggested this was far from routine. His eyes moved constantly, looking around our formation with an attention to detail that went beyond his usual thoroughness. But what bothered me most was the way he kept looking up. Not just glances, but deliberate, focused stares directed at the star-filled sky stretching endlessly above our remote installation. I followed Mitchell's command without question, tilting my head back to look around the Arctic sky above us. The stars spread out in countless tiny points of light, more brilliant than anything visible from populated areas back home. No light pollution this far north meant the entire cosmos stretched overhead in crystal clear detail, the Milky Way cutting a bright path across the darkness. But something was wrong. Mitchell raised his arm and pointed to a section of sky directly above the center of our formation. "Look there. Tell me what you see." I stared at the area he indicated, squinting through the cold air that made my eyes water. At first, I saw exactly what I expected. More stars scattered across the black canvas of night. Then my vision adjusted, and I noticed the gap. A huge section where stars should have been visible but weren't. Not clouds blocking them, not atmospheric interference. Just nothing. The absence took a rough oval shape that stretched impossibly wide across the sky. I tried to trace the edges, but they blurred into the surrounding star field, making it difficult to determine where the presence ended and open space began. Whatever was above us was massive beyond understanding, blocking out entire constellations. A low buzzing sound drifted down from overhead, barely audible at first but growing more distinct as I focused on it. The tone was steady and deep, moving through the frozen ground beneath my boots and traveling up through my body. My teeth started to ache from the vibration, and I had to clench my jaw to stop them from chattering. Not from cold this time, but from whatever force was generating that sound. "Nobody moves," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the absolute authority that made questioning him unthinkable. "Nobody speaks unless I give direct orders. No weapons, no sudden movements. And whatever you do, do not look away from it." The buzzing got a little louder, and I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The object was rotating, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. Sections of blocked stars moved position as the massive shape turned above us, revealing and concealing different portions of the sky in a gradual dance that proved this wasn't some optical illusion or atmospheric phenomenon. Minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. My feet were going numb inside my boots, and I could feel moisture from my breath freezing on the exposed skin around my mouth and nose. The cold was brutal, but the thing hovering above us commanded all my attention. Every few seconds, I caught glimpses of what might have been surface details, darker patches against the star-blocked void, subtle variations in the way it absorbed light. To my left, Daniel's breathing had become increasingly ragged, short, sharp gasps that created thick white clouds around his face. The kid was fighting panic and losing. His whole body was trembling, and not just from the cold. I wanted to say something to calm him down, but Mitchell's orders were clear. Silence was mandatory. Kyle stood about 15 feet to my right, and even without looking directly at him, I could see him moving his weight from foot to foot in tiny movements that probably went unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. His nervous energy was building, same as Daniel's fear, but manifesting differently. Where Daniel was freezing up, Kyle looked ready to bolt. The buzzing grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just sound. Whatever was generating that tone was affecting my entire body. My bones felt like they were vibrating in harmony with it, and the sensation made me want to cover my ears or step away from the formation. But Mitchell's presence kept me locked in place, along with every other soldier standing in neat rows beneath this impossible thing. 20 minutes passed according to my watch, though it felt like hours. 20 minutes of standing at attention in negative 40-degree weather while something the size of a small city hovered silently above us. My face had gone completely numb, and I was losing feeling in my fingers even inside my insulated gloves. The cold was becoming dangerous, but none of us moved. The psychological strain was worse than the physical discomfort. Standing motionless while staring up at something that shouldn't exist pushed every instinct I had toward action. Fight or flight responses kept surging through my system, only to be suppressed by military training and Mitchell's unwavering command presence. The tension was building to unbearable levels. Daniel's quiet sobbing reached my ears, barely audible above the constant buzzing, but definitely there. Soft, muffled sounds of someone reaching their breaking point. His breathing had become erratic, and even from several feet away I could see his shoulders shaking with more than just cold. The entity continued its slow rotation, revealing new sections of its underside as it moved. I tried to estimate its size, but the scale was too large to process properly. Miles across in every direction, blocking out significant portions of the night sky. Nothing human-made could be that size, and nothing natural should be hovering motionless above a military installation in the middle of Greenland. Other soldiers were starting to show signs of strain. Subtle movements, slight changes in posture, the kind of fidgeting that happens when people are pushed beyond their normal limits. But we all held formation, held position, held our silence. Because Captain Mitchell had ordered it, and because none of us knew what else to do when faced with something completely outside our understanding. The buzzing pulsed slightly, growing deeper for a few seconds before returning to its previous intensity. The change sent a wave of vibration through the ground that I felt through the soles of my boots. Whatever technology was keeping that massive object airborne was beyond anything in human capability. Daniel's sobbing became more audible, and I could see his breakdown accelerating in spite of his attempts to maintain military bearing. The kid was holding on by threads, and those threads were fraying fast. My legs felt like concrete blocks from standing motionless for so long. The cold had worked its way through every layer of gear I was wearing, settling into my bones with the kind of deep ache that would take hours by a heater to chase away. But physical discomfort took a back seat to watching Daniel unravel in slow motion. The poor bastard was maybe 20 feet to my left, and even in the dim light from the compound's exterior fixtures, I could see tears freezing into ice crystals on his cheeks. The entity above us had moved again during the past 10 minutes, revealing new sections of its underside as it continued that slow, deliberate rotation. The buzzing hadn't changed in intensity, but something about the consistency of it was wearing down my nerves. Like listening to a dental drill that never stopped, the sound had worked its way into my skull until I couldn't remember what silence felt like. Kyle was still moving his weight from foot to foot in those tiny movements that probably fooled Mitchell into thinking he was maintaining proper formation. But I could see the nervous energy building in his posture, the way his shoulders had started to bunch up. Whatever was keeping him locked in place was fighting against every instinct telling him to run. Captain Mitchell hadn't moved a muscle since ordering us to maintain position and silence. His authority was the only thing holding this formation together, and even that was starting to show cracks around the edges. Daniel's quiet breakdown was becoming impossible to ignore, and I could see other soldiers stealing looks in his direction instead of keeping their eyes fixed on the massive shape above us. The buzzing changed. Instead of the steady, continuous tone we'd been enduring for the past half hour, the sound began pulsing. Deep, vibrating waves that hit every 10 seconds like clockwork, each one strong enough to shake the ground beneath our boots. The first pulse caught me off guard, sending vibrations up through my legs and into my chest cavity. The second one rattled the windows in the nearby barracks building. Daniel screamed. The sound tore out of his throat like something being ripped apart, raw and desperate and completely beyond his control. He stumbled backward, breaking formation as his legs gave out under him. Tears streamed down his face, freezing before they could drop from his chin, and his breathing had turned into hyperventilating sobs that created thick white clouds around his head. "No, no, no," he kept repeating, the words barely recognizable through his crying. "I can't do this. I can't stay here. It's gonna kill us all." I moved without thinking, muscle memory from countless training exercises kicking in when I saw a fellow soldier in distress. 3 other guys had the same reaction, and we came together around Daniel just as he started to bolt toward the barracks. I grabbed his left arm while someone else got his right, and 2 more soldiers positioned themselves to block his path. "Hold him steady," Mitchell hissed, his voice carrying the kind of authority that cut through panic. "Keep him quiet. Do not let him break formation." But Daniel was beyond reasoning. He thrashed against our grip, his winter gear making him slippery and harder to control. The kid was strong when fear took over, and keeping him from running required all 4 of us working together. His sobbing had turned into wordless panic, the kind of sounds people make when their minds can't process what they're experiencing. "Let me go," he gasped between sobs. "Please just let me go. I have to get away from it. I have to run." Another pulse hit us, stronger than the previous ones. The vibration traveled up through the frozen ground and into our bodies, making my teeth ache and my ribs feel like they were being squeezed. The buildings around the courtyard groaned under the force of it, metal and wood creaking in protest. Daniel's struggle got worse after the pulse, like the vibration had pushed him even further toward complete breakdown. "It knows we're here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's looking at us. It's thinking about us." The pulses kept coming, steady and never stopping. Every 10 seconds, another wave of vibration that shook the entire base and made concentration impossible. I could feel my grip on Daniel's arm getting looser as the constant shaking made it harder to keep steady pressure. The other soldiers were having the same problem, and the kid was getting closer to breaking free with each pulse. Mitchell's eyes never left the entity above us, but I could see the tension in his jaw as he tried to keep control over a situation that was going beyond anyone's ability to manage. 37 soldiers standing in formation, while something the size of a city hung over their heads, and one of them was having a complete psychological breakdown that threatened to mess up whatever delicate balance was keeping the rest of us alive. Daniel twisted hard to the right, almost pulling free from the soldier holding his arm. His breathing had turned into short, panicked gasps that weren't getting enough oxygen into his lungs. The kid was going to pass out or worse if we couldn't get him calmed down, but every attempt to quiet him just seemed to make his panic worse. "I can't breathe," he wheezed. "It's in my head. The sound is in my head and I can't make it stop." Another pulse. This one was strong enough to rattle loose equipment in the buildings around us, and I heard something metallic crash to the ground inside the maintenance shed. Daniel's knees buckled, but we kept him upright. 4 grown men struggling to control one terrified soldier who'd reached his breaking point. That's when he broke free. Daniel pulled his right arm away from the soldier holding it and spun toward his left, momentum carrying him out of our grip. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, backing away from us with his hands held out in front of him like we were the threat he needed to escape from. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice raw from crying and panic. "All of you just stay back." His right hand dropped to his gun, fingers working to undo the safety strap with movements that were clumsy from cold and fear. The rest of us froze, suddenly aware that we were dealing with an armed soldier who'd lost all rational thinking. Mitchell's head snapped toward Daniel for the first time since the entity had appeared, his face showing alarm at this new development. "Soldiers, stand down," Mitchell barked. "Holster your weapon immediately." But Daniel wasn't hearing orders anymore. His weapon cleared the holster with a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the cold air, and he raised it toward the massive figure above us with both hands. His arms were shaking so badly I wasn't sure he could even aim properly. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was about to do something that might get us all killed. "I won't let it take me," Daniel said, his voice steady for the first time since his breakdown had started. "I won't let it have me." He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes lighting up his face and the immediate area around him. The sound of gunfire bounced off the buildings surrounding the courtyard, sharp cracks that cut through the constant buzzing from above. I watched the tracers disappear into the darkness overhead. 3 small points of light swallowed by something too large to understand. The moment those bullets left his weapon, everything changed. The gentle buzzing that had been our constant companion for the past 30 minutes exploded into a roar that felt like having my skull split open. The sound hit me like a physical force, driving me to my knees as pain shot through my head and down my spine. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The noise was inside my bones, vibrating through my entire body until I couldn't tell where the sound ended and my own nervous system began. The ground started shaking violently, not the rhythmic pulses we'd been experiencing, but a continuous tremor that made standing impossible. I stayed on my knees, watching cracks appear in the concrete beneath me as the entire base structure groaned under forces it was never designed to handle. Buildings swayed, and I could hear glass breaking in windows all around the courtyard. Daniel was still standing where he'd fired the shots, but something was wrong. His feet weren't touching the ground anymore. His whole body was rising slowly into the air, lifted by some invisible force that defied everything I thought I knew about physics. His arms and legs were spread wide, and his face showed confusion and terror as he realized what was happening to him. "Help me!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the thunderous roar coming from above. "Please, somebody help me." I tried to stand, tried to reach for him, but the ground was shaking too hard for me to get my feet under me. Daniel kept going up, his body 20 feet above us now and still climbing. The way he moved wasn't natural. His arms and legs twisted at angles that looked painful, like invisible hands were controlling his limbs while pulling him upward. Then I saw Kyle. The other soldier was also lifting off the ground, his boots leaving the concrete even though he hadn't fired his weapon or broken formation. Kyle's face showed pure shock as he looked down at us, his mouth open in a silent scream that was lost in the overwhelming noise. His rise was slower than Daniel's, but just as unstoppable, his body going up through the air toward the huge shape that blocked out the stars. Both soldiers were 50 feet up now, their shapes getting smaller as they disappeared into the darkness above the reach of our compound lights. Daniel's screams had stopped, either because he'd passed out or because the distance and noise made them impossible to hear. Kyle was still awake, his arms reaching down toward us in a way that was heartbreaking in how useless it was. I started crawling toward the barracks on my hands and knees, my face pressed close to the shaking concrete as the roar from above grew even louder. The vibrations were so intense that I could feel my internal organs moving around, and blood was running from my nose where the pressure had burst something inside my sinuses. Behind me, other soldiers were also trying to reach shelter, crawling or stumbling toward the nearest building as their ability to stand upright failed completely. The formation had broken down into chaos, with everyone focused on basic survival rather than military protocol. Mitchell was still on his feet somehow, his legs spread wide for balance as he stared up at the disappearing shapes of Daniel and Kyle. That's when the light hit. A brilliant white brightness erupted from the entity above us, brighter than anything I'd ever experienced. The light was so intense it turned night into day instantly, but a day that hurt to look at. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my face against the ground, but the light went through my closed eyelids like they weren't even there. The heat came with the light, a sudden wave of thermal energy that made the air around me feel like I was standing next to a blast furnace. My exposed skin started burning immediately, and I could smell the synthetic materials of my winter gear beginning to melt. The cold that had been torturing us for the past half hour was replaced by a burning heat that promised to cook us all alive within minutes. I kept crawling toward the barracks, blind and disoriented, guided only by my memory of the courtyard layout and the desperate need to find shelter from whatever was happening above us. The concrete under my hands was getting hot enough to hurt, and I could hear screaming from other soldiers who were caught in the open with no protection from the intense light. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of the base buildings beginning to collapse around us, their structures failing under forces that no human engineering had ever been designed to withstand. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Antiseptic mixed with something else I couldn't place. Burned fabric, maybe, or melted plastic. My eyes opened slowly, fighting against the bright fluorescent lights overhead. Everything felt wrong. The bed was too soft, the room too warm, and my body felt like it had been run through a meat grinder. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through my torso and down my left arm, sharp enough to make me gasp. My skin felt tight and raw, like I'd spent too long in the sun, except this was different, deeper, more serious. "Easy there," a woman's voice said from somewhere to my right. "You've been through quite an ordeal." I turned my head, slowly this time, and saw a woman in a white coat standing beside my bed. She had auburn hair pulled back and green eyes behind rectangular glasses. Professional, but not unkind. The nameplate on her coat read Dr. S. Collins. Where am I? My voice came out as a croak, like I hadn't used it in days. "Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany," she said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "You've been unconscious for 3 weeks. I'm Dr. Collins, your attending physician." 3 weeks. The words hit me like getting punched. 3 weeks since that night in Greenland. Since the entity. Since Daniel and Kyle had been pulled up into that thing, screaming. Dr. Collins was checking something on her clipboard, but I could see her watching my reaction carefully. "Do you remember what happened?" I tried to piece together the fragments, the formation in the courtyard, the massive shape blocking out the stars, Daniel firing his weapon, the light that burned everything. Then nothing. "There was an explosion," I said carefully. The words felt wrong in my mouth, but something told me to be cautious about what I shared. "That's what the reports indicate," Dr. Collins replied, her tone neutral. "A catastrophic equipment malfunction at your installation. The rescue teams found you near the perimeter of the blast zone." Equipment malfunction. Right. I looked down at my body for the first time and understood why everything hurt so much. My arms and chest were wrapped in white bandages, with patches of red seeping through in several places. My left arm was stuck in a cast that ran from my wrist to just below my shoulder. "How bad is it?" I asked. Dr. Collins set down her clipboard and met my eyes. "You suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns over approximately 30% of your body. Your left arm was broken in 2 places, the radius and ulna. We've stabilized both fractures, but you'll need extensive physical therapy. The burns are healing well considering the severity." I nodded, trying to process the information. Burns. From that intense white light that had come from the entity. But according to her, it was just an explosion. "What about the others?" I asked. "My unit." Her expression grew more serious. 23 members of your unit didn't survive the incident, including your commanding officer, Captain Mitchell. Mitchell. Dead. The man who had kept us in formation under that thing, who had maintained discipline even when faced with something impossible. Gone. "There were 14 survivors total," Dr. Collins continued. "Most suffered injuries similar to yours. You were actually among the less severely affected. Less severely affected. I tried to imagine what the others looked like if my condition was considered mild. 2 of my men, I said, thinking of Daniel and Kyle rising into the darkness. Daniel Ramsey and Kyle Jensen. Are they missing? Dr. Collins said. Their bodies weren't recovered from the blast site. They're listed as missing, presumed dead. Missing. Not dead. Missing. Because they hadn't been killed by any explosion. They'd been taken, pulled up into that massive thing that hung over our base. Dr. Collins was studying my face again, and I realized I needed to be more careful about my reactions. Whatever story they were telling about an equipment malfunction, it was the official version, and something told me that contradicting it would be a mistake. The entire installation was destroyed, she continued. Satellite imagery shows a crater where the main buildings once stood. Communications were completely severed during the incident, which is why it took 3 days for rescue teams to reach the site. A crater. Of course there was a crater. That thing had let loose enough energy to melt buildings and cook people alive. But somehow it was being explained as an equipment problem. Over the next several days, as I slowly got my strength back, I learned more about my situation. The medical staff treated me well, but there was something strange about the level of security around my case. Nurses came and went on strict schedules, and I noticed they avoided making eye contact or talking casually. When I asked questions about my treatment or what would happen to me, they sent me back to Dr. Collins. The questioning started on my 5th day awake. The first official was a colonel whose name I didn't catch, wearing dress uniform and carrying a digital recorder. He sat beside my bed and asked me to walk through the events of that night in detail. I remember the alarm going off, I told him. Captain Mitchell ordered us to assemble outside. Then there was some kind of explosion. What can you tell me about the moments leading up to the explosion? He asked. We were in formation. It was cold. Then everything went white, and I don't remember anything else until I woke up here. He made notes on a tablet, nodding along with my answers, but his questions felt rehearsed, like he was checking boxes rather than trying to understand what happened. When I mentioned Daniel and Kyle specifically, he noted their names, but didn't ask for additional details about their disappearance. The second debriefing came 2 days later, conducted by a different officer, a major from intelligence. Her questions were more pointed, more focused on specific details that seemed oddly important to her. Did you observe any unusual atmospheric conditions that night? She asked. It was clear, I said. Cold but clear. Any equipment malfunctions prior to the incident? Not that I noticed. Did any personnel exhibit unusual behavior or make statements that might indicate foreknowledge of the equipment failure? That question made me pause, knowing ahead of time, as if someone had known what was going to happen. No, I said. Everyone seemed surprised by the emergency assembly. She wrote a lot in her notebook, but like the colonel, she seemed more interested in confirming a story she already had than discovering new information. The third meeting was run by someone who didn't introduce himself or provide any identification. He wore civilian clothes and spoke with the kind of authority that suggested he outranked everyone else I'd spoken with. His questions were the most disturbing. In your opinion, Sergeant Anderson, what caused the explosion? I don't know, I said. Some kind of equipment failure, I assume. Have you discussed the incident with any of the other survivors? No, I haven't seen any of them. Good. For security reasons, we're keeping survivor accounts separate during the investigation. You understand? I understood that they were making sure none of us could compare stories or contradict the official version of events. Is there anything else you think we should know about that night? Anything at all that might help us understand what went wrong? I looked into his eyes and saw something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't curiosity or concern for preventing future accidents. This was a test. He was checking to see if I would stick to the approved story or if I would say something that required correction. "No," I said. "I've told you everything I remember." He closed his notebook and stood up. "Excellent. Your cooperation is appreciated, Sergeant. This incident is classified at the highest levels, as I'm sure you understand. Discussion of operational details with unauthorized personnel is strictly prohibited." After he left, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The burns on my chest hurt with each heartbeat, and my broken arm ached constantly even with the pain medication. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the growing realization of what was happening. They were covering it up. The entity, the abductions, the impossible technology that had destroyed our base. None of it would ever see the light of day. 23 soldiers were dead, 2 were missing, and 14 were lying in hospital beds with classified medical records. All of it explained away as an equipment malfunction. Dr. Collins checked on me that evening during her rounds. She looked at my chart and adjusted my medication dosage, maintaining the professional behavior she'd shown since my first day awake. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better," I said. "The pain is manageable." She nodded and made a note. "Your burns are healing ahead of schedule. The arm will take longer, but you should regain full function with proper physical therapy." "Dr. Collins," I said carefully, "the other survivors, are they recovering as well?" She paused in her writing and looked at me directly. "Most are progressing appropriately given their injuries. I'd like to see them, talk to them about what happened." "I'm afraid that's not possible," she said, and something in her tone suggested the decision wasn't hers. "Patient isolation is required during the investigation." Investigation. Right. Into an equipment problem that created a massive crater and left 14 people with severe burns. "Will I be able to return to duty?" I asked. Dr. Collins closed my chart and tucked it under her arm. "That will depend on your recovery and the determination of the medical review board. For now, focus on getting better." After she left, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a note on my medical bracelet that hadn't been there the previous day, a small red sticker with a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me. But the fact that it had appeared overnight, without explanation, told me everything I needed to know about how closely my case was being watched. I was a witness to something they needed to keep buried. And until they decided what to do with me, I would remain in this hospital bed, cut off from the other survivors, giving carefully written answers to planned questions. The official story was simple: equipment breakdown, tragic accident, heroic rescue efforts. 23 brave soldiers killed in the line of duty, their families receiving folded flags and military honors. But I knew the truth. I had seen that massive shape blocking out the stars. I had felt the vibrations from its impossible engines. I had watched Daniel and Kyle being pulled up into the darkness, alive and screaming. And now I was part of the cover-up, whether I wanted to be or not. I was scheduled for discharge the following Tuesday. 3 weeks of medical evaluations, physical therapy sessions, and carefully monitored recovery had brought me to the point where Dr. Collins felt comfortable releasing me back into the world. My burns had healed better than expected, leaving patches of discolored skin across my chest and arms that would be permanent reminders of that night. The cast on my left arm had been replaced with a removable brace, and while my range of motion was still limited, the fractures were mending properly. The debriefings had stopped after that third interview with the unnamed official. No one had asked me any more questions about the equipment malfunction or my memories of the incident. The medical staff treated me like any other patient recovering from severe injuries, and the unusual security measures from my first week had been quietly discontinued. I was beginning to think the worst was behind me. That changed on Thursday afternoon. I was working through my physical therapy exercises, slowly rotating my left shoulder to rebuild strength, when the door to my room opened without the usual knock. A man stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. He wore an expensive black suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for his body. The fabric was so dark it seemed to absorb light, and every crease was perfectly sharp for what must have been a long day of travel. His hair was perfectly styled, dark with silver streaks at the temples, and his pale blue eyes moved around the room in a methodical sweep before settling on me. "Sergeant Anderson," he said, his voice carrying a measured precision that made my skin crawl. "I'm Richard Black." He didn't offer his hand or provide any additional identification. Just stood there beside my bed, hands clasped behind his back, studying me like I was an interesting specimen under a microscope. "I represent a government oversight committee that handles sensitive incidents, like the one you experienced in Greenland," he continued. "May I sit down?" It wasn't really a question. He was already pulling the visitor's chair closer to my bed, moving it so he could speak quietly, without being overheard. Richard Black sat down in the chair with careful movements, adjusting his suit jacket once before focusing his full attention on me. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," I said carefully. "Ready to go home." "Excellent. Recovery from traumatic events can be challenging." Richard leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes never blinking. "That's actually why I'm here, to discuss your recovery and your future." Something about his tone made my mouth go dry. This wasn't a wellness check or a routine visit from military administration. This felt like something else entirely. "The incident at your installation was truly unfortunate," Richard continued. "Equipment malfunctions of that magnitude are rare, but when they occur, they create complex situations that require careful management." Equipment malfunction. He was sticking to the official story, but the way he said it made it clear he knew exactly what had really happened that night. Incidents like this one involve national security considerations that extend far beyond the immediate casualties, Richard said. The technology that was being tested at your facility, the experimental equipment that malfunctioned so catastrophically, represents classified research that our adversaries would find extremely valuable. I nodded, playing along with his story while getting more nervous. Experimental equipment. That was their explanation for the entity that had floated over our base. For this reason, the details of what occurred that night must remain absolutely confidential, Richard continued. Not just for weeks or months, but permanently, for the rest of your life. The way he emphasized those last words made my blood turn cold. "I understand the psychological impact of surviving such a traumatic event," Richard said, his voice remaining perfectly calm and conversational. "The human mind wants to process trauma by discussing it, sharing the burden with others. It's a natural healing response." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the small table beside my bed. "However, in this case, that natural response would pose unacceptable risks to national security," Richard continued. "Discussion of the incident with anyone, family members, friends, medical professionals, journalists, researchers, would result in immediate and permanent consequences." Richard opened the envelope and took out several photographs, putting them on the table where I could see them clearly. Black and white pictures of men in military uniforms, their faces serious and professional. Personnel photos, the kind taken for official records. These individuals were involved in similar classified incidents over the past 2 decades, Richard explained, his tone remaining conversational despite the disturbing nature of what he was showing me. Each of them signed confidentiality agreements identical to the one you'll be signing before your discharge. He placed additional items beside the photographs, newspaper clippings with headlines that made my stomach drop. "Former soldier found dead in apparent suicide." Missing veteran's body discovered in remote location. Car accident claims life of decorated serviceman. Unfortunately, some individuals found the burden of secrecy too difficult to bear, Richard said. They attempted to share their experiences with unauthorized personnel, family members, therapists, in one case, a journalist. My hands were shaking now, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. Richard noticed anyway, his pale eyes tracking the tremor in my fingers. The consequences were immediate and irreversible, he continued. National security cannot be compromised by individual psychological needs, no matter how understandable those needs might be. Richard gathered the photographs and newspaper clippings, sliding them back into the envelope. But he left one item on the table, a business card with no name or title, just a phone number printed in simple black text. "This is for you," Richard said, indicating the card. "If you ever feel tempted to discuss the incident, call that number first. Someone will be available to help you work through those feelings without compromising classified information." He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket with movements that were precise to the point of being mechanical. "I want to be clear about something, Sergeant Anderson," Richard said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The world is not ready for certain truths. Widespread knowledge of what happened at your installation would cause panic on a global scale. Civilization as we know it would collapse into chaos within weeks." I stared at the business card on the table, my mind racing through the implications of everything he'd just told me. "The greater good sometimes requires individual sacrifice," Richard continued. "Your silence protects not just national security, but the psychological stability of billions of people who aren't equipped to handle reality as it actually exists." Richard walked to the door and paused with his hand on the handle. "Enjoy your recovery, Sergeant Anderson. Live your life. Start a family if you choose. But remember that your continued existence depends on your discretion." The door closed behind him with that same soft click, leaving me alone with the business card and the absolute certainty that my life would never be my own again. I picked up the card and read the number, memorizing it even though I had no intention of ever calling. Richard Black and his oversight committee would be watching me forever, waiting for me to make a mistake that would justify my permanent disappearance. The price of my survival was simple: complete and eternal silence about the night that had changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The discharge papers were in my hands. 6 months of medical checkups, physical therapy, and carefully watched psychological tests had led to this moment. My official release from the United States Army with full military benefits and a 60% disability rating. The burns had healed into patches of skin that would never quite match the rest of my body, and my left arm moved with a slight stiffness that physical therapy couldn't completely get rid of. Major Harrison, the officer handling my discharge processing, looked over each document with the same careful attention he'd shown every other veteran passing through his office that week. Medical clearance, housing allowance documentation, disability pension paperwork, benefits enrollment forms, all stamped and signed in triplicate. "Congratulations, Sergeant Anderson," he said, sliding the final set of papers across his desk. "You've served your country with distinction, and these benefits will help support you as you transition back to civilian life." Served with distinction. The phrase rang hollow, considering my service record was now classified at levels that prevented anyone from discussing the circumstances of my injuries. According to my official file, I'd been injured in a training accident involving experimental equipment. Clean, simple, and completely false. The bus ride back to Denver took 18 hours, winding through mountain passes and small towns that looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood. Nothing had changed in the 2 years since I'd left for my Arctic posting. Same gas stations, same fast food restaurants, same billboards advertising local businesses. The world had continued exactly as before, while I had experienced something that broke every assumption I'd held about reality. My parents met me at the Greyhound station downtown, both of them looking older than I remembered. Dad's hair had gone completely silver, and Mom moved with the careful steps of someone fighting arthritis. They hugged me carefully, mindful of my injuries, and asked the questions I'd been dreading during the entire bus ride. "How are you feeling, honey?" Mom asked as we walked to their car. "The doctor said you're healing well, but we've been so worried." "Better every day," I said, which was technically true. The physical healing was progressing ahead of schedule. The psychological damage was another matter entirely. "What exactly happened up there?" Dad asked as he started the engine. The Army wasn't very specific in their letters, just said there was an accident with some kind of equipment. Training accident. Experimental equipment malfunction. I repeated the approved version of events, watching my father's face in the rearview mirror as he nodded along with the explanation. He'd served in Vietnam and understood that some things couldn't be discussed, even with family. But I could see the questions in his eyes, the concern that went beyond what my official story warranted. Moving back into my childhood bedroom felt weird. Posters from high school still hung on the walls, and my old desk held the same scattered textbooks I'd left behind when I enlisted. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, preserved like a museum exhibit of a person who no longer existed. The first panic attack hit during my third day home. Mom had suggested we go grocery shopping together, and I'd agreed without thinking about what that would involve. The supermarket on Saturday afternoon was packed with families buying food for weekend barbecues and birthday parties. Kids ran between the aisles while their parents compared prices and checked items off shopping lists. The crowds pressed in from every direction, too many people moving too quickly, creating a chaos of motion and noise that made concentration impossible. My chest got tight, and breathing became difficult as some primitive part of my brain interpreted the crowded store as a threat requiring immediate escape. Worse was the constant airplane traffic overhead. Denver International Airport generated a steady stream of commercial flights throughout the day, and each engine sound made me freeze and look around the ceiling as if something might crash through at any moment. The rational part of my mind knew these were passenger jets following normal flight patterns, but my body reacted to every aircraft as if it might be hovering silently above us, waiting. "Are you okay?" Mom asked, noticing my upward glances and increasing agitation. "You seem nervous." "Just adjusting," I said, abandoning our shopping cart and heading for the exit. "Maybe we can try this again another day." The incident repeated itself everywhere I went. Restaurants became hard to handle when the dining room filled up. Movie theaters were impossible due to the dark enclosed space and crowds. Even walking downtown made me constantly check the sky and plan escape routes from potential aerial threats. My parents noticed but said my behavior was normal readjustment difficulties. Dad had known plenty of veterans who struggled with crowds and loud noises after combat deployments. They gave me space and time, expecting that patience and family support would help me work through whatever I was processing. The mandatory therapy sessions started 3 weeks after my return. The VA hospital assigned me to Dr. Monica Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in combat-related trauma. Her office was designed to feel comfortable and non-threatening, with soft lighting and earth-tone furniture arranged to encourage open conversation. Dr. Walsh was probably in her late 30s with warm brown eyes and a naturally empathetic expression that put most patients at ease. She wore comfortable professional clothes in subdued colors and spoke with the kind of patience that suggested she'd helped hundreds of veterans work through similar problems. "Tell me about your military service," she said during our first session, settling back in her chair with a notepad balanced on her knee. "What drew you to enlist?" Safe territory. I could discuss my decision to join the Army, my basic training experience, and my early assignments without getting into classified information. Dr. Walsh listened carefully, occasionally asking follow-up questions that helped her understand my background and personality. "Your medical records indicate you were injured in a training accident in Greenland," she said, consulting her notes. "That must have been traumatic." "It was unexpected," I said carefully. "Equipment malfunctioned. Several people were killed." "Survivor guilt is common after incidents like that," Dr. Walsh said. "Losing fellow soldiers, especially in a non-combat situation, can create complex emotional responses." She was giving me an opening to discuss the real source of my trauma, but I couldn't take it. Richard's threats repeated in my memory every time I considered telling the truth. The photographs of dead veterans, the newspaper clippings, the promise of immediate and permanent consequences for anyone who compromised national security. Sometimes it helps to talk through the specific details of traumatic events, Dr. Walsh continued. "I know it's difficult, but processing those memories in a safe environment can reduce their psychological impact." "I don't remember much," I lied. "Everything happened very quickly, and then I was unconscious until I woke up in the hospital." Dr. Walsh made notes but didn't push. She was experienced enough to recognize when patients weren't ready to face their trauma directly. Instead, she focused on coping strategies and practical techniques for managing anxiety and being overly alert. Over the following weeks, our sessions followed a consistent pattern. Dr. Walsh would ask gently about my time in Greenland, and I would avoid the topic with vague responses about memory gaps and confusion. She recommended breathing exercises for panic attacks and suggested exposure therapy to help me become more comfortable in crowded situations. "Your symptoms are consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder," she said during our 6th session, "but the severity seems disproportionate to what you've described about the accident." She was too sharp. The standard PTSD treatment wasn't helping my real problems because she didn't know what had actually caused them. Watching Daniel and Kyle being pulled up into an impossible entity wasn't something that could be worked through with regular therapy methods. "Sometimes traumatic memories surface gradually," Dr. Walsh continued. "Details that seemed lost can emerge weeks or months later as the mind processes the experience. If that happens, I want you to know this is a safe space to explore those memories." I nodded and agreed to continue the breathing exercises, knowing that no therapy could help as long as I was forced to lie about everything that mattered. The nightmares were getting worse instead of better. Nearly every night, I relived that moment when the entity's light burst across our formation. The intensity was beyond anything I could describe, not just bright, but somehow alive and aware. In the dreams, I could hear Daniel screaming as he was pulled upward, his voice carrying across impossible distances until it mixed with the buzzing that had come before the disaster. Sleep medication helped me fall asleep, but couldn't prevent the dreams from coming. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, my heart racing as I checked the ceiling and windows to make sure nothing was floating overhead. The prescribed sleep aids left me tired and confused the next day, creating a cycle of exhaustion that made everything else more difficult. My parents tried to include me in family activities and social gatherings, hoping that normal interactions would help me readjust. Sunday dinners with extended relatives became exercises in maintaining false normalcy while managing constant anxiety. Cousins asked about my military service, and I repeated the cleaned-up version of events until it felt rehearsed and hollow. Uncle Ray, who'd served in the Navy during the Gulf War, pulled me aside after one dinner to offer advice about transitioning back to civilian life. He meant well, but his suggestions about finding purpose and building new routines felt irrelevant to my situation. How could I explain that my real problem wasn't adjusting to civilian life, but living with knowledge that could get me killed if I shared it with anyone? 6 months of this existence had convinced me that normal life was impossible. Every day required constant vigilance and careful lies to people who cared about me. The burden of secrecy was crushing, and the isolation of being unable to share my real experiences with anyone was worse than physical pain. The decision became clear during a particularly bad episode at a shopping mall. A low-flying aircraft had triggered a panic attack severe enough that security guards had to help me to a quiet area until I could breathe normally again. The concerned faces of strangers, the whispered conversations about the obviously disturbed veteran, the embarrassment of being unable to function in basic social situations, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. I couldn't live among people while carrying this secret. The constant pretense was destroying what remained of my sanity, and the fear of accidentally revealing classified information made every conversation feel dangerous. Richard's business card remained in my wallet, a constant reminder that speaking the truth would mean death. That evening, I researched remote properties in states with minimal air traffic and low population density. Montana offered vast wilderness areas where a person could live completely alone, far from commercial flight paths and curious neighbors. My disability pension, combined with savings from my military service, would be enough to purchase a modest cabin and survive indefinitely without employment. The isolation would be complete, but isolation felt safer than the alternative. In the mountains, I wouldn't need to lie to therapists or family members. I wouldn't need to check crowded spaces for threats or explain my strange behavior when aircraft passed overhead. I could live with the truth in solitude rather than slowly destroying myself with necessary deceptions. Dr. Walsh tried to discourage the move during our final session. Geographic isolation often worsens PTSD symptoms, she warned. Human connection and social support are crucial for processing trauma. Moving away from your family and cutting yourself off from professional help could significantly harm your recovery. Her concern was genuine, and her advice was probably correct for normal cases. But my situation wasn't normal, and conventional treatment couldn't address problems caused by classified experiences that I could never discuss. I need some time alone to figure things out, I told her. Maybe later I'll be ready for more intensive therapy, but right now I just need space. Dr. Walsh gave me her card and made me promise to call if I needed help. She suspected there were things I wasn't telling her, but professional ethics stopped her from pressing too hard. I thanked her for her patience and walked out of the VA hospital for the last time. The cabin I bought was 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable during winter months. No neighbors within 5 miles, no commercial air routes overhead, and no cell phone coverage. Perfect isolation from everything that reminded me of that night in Greenland, and from everyone who might ask questions I couldn't answer. Moving day felt like a funeral for the person I'd been before the Arctic posting. My parents helped load my few possessions into a rented truck, their faces showing worry and confusion about my decision. They'd hoped that time and family support would help me heal, and my choice to isolate completely felt like a rejection of their efforts. "Are you sure about this?" Mom asked as we secured the last box. "You don't have to face this alone." But I did have to face it alone. Living with people meant constant lies and performance of normalcy that was slowly killing me. In the mountains, I could be honest about my fear and watchfulness without having to explain or justify anything to anyone. The drive to Montana took 2 days, winding through mountain passes that got more and more remote. Each mile that separated me from civilization felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. No crowds, no aircraft noise, no concerned family members asking questions I couldn't answer truthfully. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. The isolation that Dr. Walsh had warned against felt like salvation rather than exile. I was finally free to live with the truth, even if that truth could never be shared with another human being. I pulled the last screw from the motion detector's housing and connected the final wire to my homemade alarm system. 15 years of worry had taught me to trust my own work over anything store-bought. Commercial security equipment could be hacked or disabled by people with the right tools and clearance. My system was different, a network of salvaged parts and military surplus sensors that I'd wired myself, creating something unique enough that no government manual would explain how to bypass it. The cabin had changed a lot since that first winter in 2009. What started as a simple retreat had turned into a fortress designed to detect any approach from land or air. Motion sensors covered every trail within a half-mile radius. Vibration detectors buried along the access road would register vehicles long before they came into view. Cameras hidden in weatherproof housings monitored the perimeter, feeding to screens I'd mounted throughout the interior. Most importantly, the aircraft detection array I'd built on the roof tracked everything that passed overhead. Parabolic microphones connected to frequency analyzers could identify engine types and flight patterns from miles away. A modified radio scanner monitored air traffic control communications, while a directional antenna system triangulated the exact positions of anything flying within a 50-mile radius. Every contact went into my logs. 15 years of careful records filled dozens of notebooks, each entry documenting date, time, aircraft type, flight path, altitude, and duration of observation. Commercial airliners following established routes between major cities. Military training flights from Malmstrom Air Force Base. Medical helicopters responding to emergencies. Crop dusters working ranches during growing season. And the others. The ones that didn't follow predictable patterns or respond to radio calls. The ones that circled my property before continuing on courses that made no sense. The ones that appeared on my sensors without generating any engine noise whatsoever. Those entries were marked with red ink and kept in a separate notebook. 47 unexplained contacts over 15 years. Not enough to establish a pattern, but too many to dismiss as coincidence. Someone was watching me, and they were using technology that shouldn't exist according to public knowledge. The government vehicles were easier to spot. Twice each year, usually during spring and fall, an unmarked sedan would park on the main highway where the access road branched off toward my property. Different cars, different license plates, but always the same behavior. They'd sit there for hours, people inside using binoculars and cameras to watch anyone who turned down my road. I'd learned to approach my own driveway carefully, using back trails that kept me out of their line of sight until I could confirm whether surveillance was active. On days when the watchers were present, I'd camp in the woods until they left, rather than risk leading them directly to my cabin. The aging had accelerated during my early 40s. Stress and isolation carved lines deeper than sun and weather should have managed. My hair went completely gray before my 45th birthday, and my hands developed a tremor that worsened whenever aircraft passed overhead. The mirror reflected a man who looked older than his father had at the same age, but the nightmares had become manageable through rigid routine and complete avoidance of triggers. No television news, no radio programs, no internet access that might accidentally expose me to content about Arctic incidents or government cover-ups. The outside world existed only as entries in my surveillance logs and occasional supply runs to town for necessities I couldn't produce myself. Self-sufficiency had become both survival strategy and obsession. I'd taught myself electronics repair using manuals ordered through mail catalogs, eventually becoming skilled enough to build my own equipment from salvaged parts. Engine maintenance was next. Generators, water pumps, the old truck I used for supply runs. Then basic medicine, food preservation, construction techniques for reinforcing the cabin's defenses. Books were my only real connection to the broader world, but I chose them carefully. Technical manuals, historical accounts of government secrecy, memoirs by whistleblowers who'd exposed classified programs. I avoided fiction entirely. Imaginary stories felt like lies after living with such devastating truth. It was the UFO research that changed everything. I'd resisted reading about unidentified aerial phenomena for years, afraid that learning about other incidents might make my own memories more vivid and harder to suppress. But by 2018, isolation had worn down my resistance to the point where I needed to know whether others had experienced similar encounters. The similarities were disturbing and undeniable. Military personnel describing massive objects that blocked out stars. Witnesses reporting low-frequency buzzing that vibrated through their bones. Soldiers who'd been injured or disappeared during encounters with technology that defied regular physics. Survivors who'd been threatened into silence by government officials in expensive suits. My experience in Greenland wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern stretching back decades, possibly longer. The entity that had hovered over our base was one of many, and the cover-up I was part of extended far beyond a single incident at a remote Arctic installation. Each book revealed new pieces of a larger picture. The Phoenix Lights incident in 1997, the Belgian UFO wave of 1989 to 1990, the Rendlesham Forest encounter in 1980. Dozens of military witnesses had come forward in spite of threats and ridicule, sharing details that matched my own memories with frightening accuracy. Some had paid the price for speaking out. Careers destroyed, families threatened, mysterious deaths that matched the newspaper clippings Richard had shown me 15 years earlier. But others had survived, finding strength in numbers as more witnesses emerged from decades of enforced silence. I began to understand that my isolation wasn't just self-imposed exile, it was complicity. Every year I remained silent was another year the truth stayed buried. Every day I chose personal safety over public knowledge was another day the cover-up succeeded in keeping humanity ignorant of reality. I'd built this fortress to protect myself from the consequences of speaking out, but in doing so I'd become part of the machine that suppressed evidence of the most important discovery in human history. Richard's business card remained in my wallet, edges worn from years of nervous handling. The number had never been called, but its presence was a constant reminder of the choice I'd made. Safety through silence, survival through complicity. A life preserved at the cost of truth. 15 years of careful isolation had kept me alive, but turned me into something I barely recognized. The young soldier who'd witnessed impossible technology had become an aging hermit who documented aircraft like a monk copying scripture, recording evidence he'd never share while helping maintain the very secrecy that was slowly destroying him. The surveillance continued, but my watchers were patient. They knew I wasn't going anywhere, wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't threatening their carefully maintained narrative about equipment malfunctions and training accidents. I'd become exactly what they wanted, a neutralized witness living in fear and solitude. But the books had planted seeds of doubt about whether continued silence was sustainable. Other witnesses were speaking out in spite of the risks. Patterns were emerging that suggested the truth might be stronger than the forces trying to suppress it. The world was changing, and my mountain fortress was beginning to feel less like protection and more like a prison I'd built for myself. The news article changed everything. I'd been avoiding current events for 15 years, but a supply run to town in March had left me exposed to a newspaper headline at the gas station checkout. Pentagon confirms military encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena under investigation. I bought the paper and 3 others, driving back to the cabin with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The articles described incidents spanning decades, military pilots reporting objects that moved in ways that broke the laws of physics, radar operators tracking craft that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and most importantly, ground personnel who'd seen massive structures hovering silently over secure installations. The details were too close to ignore. Low-frequency buzzing that vibrated through bones, objects large enough to block stars from view, technology that seemed decades ahead of anything publicly known, and survivors who'd been threatened into silence by unnamed government officials. I wasn't alone. The isolation I'd wrapped around myself like armor had been built on a lie. Other witnesses existed, and some were finally talking after taking the risks Richard and his colleagues had used to control us for decades. The decision didn't come suddenly. 3 months of research through carefully chosen internet searches at the library in town showed me a pattern that broke my understanding of how well the truth had been hidden. Pentagon officials were admitting the reality of unidentified aerial phenomena. Former military personnel were testifying before Congress about encounters they'd kept secret for years. News organizations were treating the subject seriously instead of dismissing it as conspiracy theory. The world was changing, and the walls of secrecy that had trapped me in this mountain prison were showing cracks. Richard's threats might still carry weight, but they were no longer absolute. Other survivors were proving that speaking out was possible, even if dangerous. By June, I'd made the choice that had felt impossible for 15 years. The weight of silence had become too much, pressing down on my chest every morning when I woke up to check my security monitors and aircraft logs. Each day of continued secrecy felt like betrayal. Of Daniel and Kyle, of the other soldiers who died that night, and of a world that deserved to know what was being hidden from them. I started writing in July, working at the kitchen table where I'd eaten solitary meals for over a decade. Every detail I could remember from that night in Greenland went onto paper in careful longhand, page after page of testimony that felt both dangerous and necessary. The alarm sounding at 3:17 a.m., Captain Mitchell's decision to assemble us in deadly cold, the impossible size of the entity blocking stars from view, Daniel's breakdown and the shots that changed everything, the light that followed, and the way my fellow soldiers were pulled up into darkness while screaming. The writing process took months. Each session brought back memories I'd spent years trying to forget, but also provided relief I hadn't expected. Putting the truth onto paper made it real in a way that my private knowledge never had. These weren't just traumatic memories anymore. They were evidence. Testimony. A record that could survive even if I didn't. I documented everything else too. Richard's visit to the hospital, the photographs of dead witnesses, the threats that had shaped 15 years of my life, the surveillance I'd detected around my property, the red-marked entries in my aircraft logs that recorded unexplained contacts over the years. All of it went into a comprehensive account that painted a picture much larger than a single incident at a remote Arctic base. The logistics of distribution required careful planning. Multiple channels meant multiple opportunities for the truth to reach the public, even if some copies were intercepted or suppressed. I identified journalists who'd covered similar stories, researchers who specialized in government secrecy, and family members I trusted to follow through on my instructions. 27 complete copies were prepared by October. Each package contained my full written testimony, copies of relevant documents from my military service, photographs of the surveillance equipment I'd built, and detailed logs of unexplained aircraft activity over my property. I included specific instructions that everything should be released simultaneously if I disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The mailing took place over several weeks, using different post offices in 3 counties to avoid creating patterns that might be detected. Some packages went to investigative reporters at major newspapers. Others went to documentary filmmakers who'd examined government cover-ups. Congressional representatives who'd shown interest in disclosure received copies, along with researchers at universities studying aerial phenomena. My parents got a package with a letter explaining why I'd chosen isolation and why I was now choosing to speak out. The guilt of lying to them for 15 years had been almost as heavy as the secret itself. They deserved to understand what had really happened to their son, even if learning the truth put them at risk. The weapons came next. My military training hadn't included heavy combat, but 15 years of mountain living had taught me enough about firearms to prepare for what might be coming. The rifle I'd used for hunting was joined by a shotgun and handgun, along with enough ammunition to hold off a small force for several hours. I had no illusions about surviving a determined government assault, but I wouldn't make it easy for them. Food supplies were already extensive. Years of paranoid preparation had left me equipped to survive months without outside contact. Water came from a well I'd dug myself, with backup purification systems in case the main supply was compromised. The generator had enough fuel to run essential systems for weeks, and the solar panels I'd installed could maintain basic power indefinitely. Most importantly, I'd prepared multiple ways to communicate with the outside world, if the cabin came under siege. A ham radio hidden in the woods could reach operators hundreds of miles away. Emergency beacons were concealed in locations that would take days to find and neutralize. Dead man switches were set up to automatically transmit my testimony if I failed to reset them at regular intervals. The preparations felt simultaneously necessary and absurd. I was a 52-year-old man preparing for war against the most powerful government in history, armed with hunting rifles and jury-rigged electronics. But the alternative was continuing to live as Richard's prisoner, helping maintain the secrecy that kept humanity ignorant of its true situation in the universe. November brought the first signs that my decision was having consequences. The surveillance around my property increased dramatically. Aircraft that didn't appear on any flight tracking systems circled overhead with increasing frequency. The motion sensors along my access road triggered repeatedly, though my cameras never captured whatever was moving out there. They knew. Whether through intercepted communications, compromised mail systems, or simple deduction based on my behavior changes, Richard's people had detected that something was different. The 15-year truce was ending, and both sides were preparing for what came next. I spent Thanksgiving alone, as I had every year since moving to Montana, but this time felt different. Instead of another day of self-imposed exile, it marked the countdown to a choice that would define the rest of my life, however long that might be. The packages had been mailed, the testimony was written, the preparations were complete. Richard's business card lay on the kitchen table where I'd placed it 3 days earlier, its worn edges catching morning light from the window. 15 years of threats and surveillance. 15 years of choosing survival over truth. 15 years of complicity in the greatest cover-up in human history. The weight was gone, not the fear. That remained sharp and immediate, tightening my chest whenever aircraft passed overhead. But the crushing pressure of carrying this secret alone had lifted the moment I'd committed those memories to paper and sent them into the world. Whatever happened now, the truth would survive. My hands were steady as I picked up the phone and dialed the number I'd memorized years ago but never called. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm and measured in the early hour. "Robert," Richard said, as if he'd been expecting this call for 15 years. "I think it's time we talked."